It was a Monday morning, October 11th, 1918. In the sleepy fishing towns of Puerto Rico's west coast, the sun had barely risen. Fishermen were mending their nets. Children were walking to school. The air was still and heavy with the humid promise of a tropical day. No one was expecting a disaster. But at 10:14 a.m., the ground didn't just shake, it screamed. A magnitude 7.1 earthquake ripped along the Mona Passage, the deep trench between Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. The island was yanked from side to side. In Aguadilla, a church tower crashed into the street. Cracks split the earth like lightning. People ran into the open, screaming, praying. For 2 long minutes, the land convulsed. Then silence. But silence is not peace, not in a tsunami. What most people don't know is that the real terror didn't come from the earthquake. It came from the ocean. And it came in just 4 minutes. 4 minutes. That's less time than it takes to boil a pot of coffee. In that window, the sea didn't just rise, it pulled back. Fishermen in the bay watched in horror as the water retreated hundreds of yards, exposing coral, rocks, and the rotting hulls of old ships. The sea floor was naked, and that was the only warning they would get. Then the wave hit. Not a slow surge. A wall of dark water, 6 meters high, 20 feet. It didn't roll in. It exploded onto the shore. The village of Aguadilla was erased in seconds. Wooden homes were shredded like paper. A stone bridge was lifted from its foundations and tossed inland. Bodies of men, women, and children were carried through the streets, tangled in debris. The wave didn't stop at the beach. It pushed 2 kilometers inland, past the town square, into the sugarcane fields. When the water finally receded, it left behind a landscape of mud and silence. 116 people were dead. 40 of them had been killed by the tsunami alone. Entire families were gone. Survivors wandered the ruins, calling out names that would never be answered. Here is the detail that haunts me. This was not a forgotten island in the middle of nowhere. Puerto Rico was, and is, a territory of the United States. American citizens died that morning. American soil shook. American shores were drowned. And yet, ask anyone today about the 1918 tsunami in Puerto Rico. They will look at you blankly. This is not in the history books. It is not taught in American schools. It is a ghost story. Why? Because the island was invisible to the mainland. Because the dead were not white. Because the disaster was not in New York or San Francisco. It was in a colony. And the silence after the wave was louder than the wave itself. This is the story of a catastrophe that happened in America. And the shocking truth that almost no one knows it did. To understand why this disaster vanished from memory, you have to understand what Puerto Rico was in 1918. It was not a state. It was not a country. It was a possession. A trophy from the Spanish-American War, taken by the United States just 20 years earlier. The people were American subjects, not American citizens. They had no vote in Congress, no representation, no voice. And when a tsunami drowns a voiceless people, the world does not hear them scream. The earthquake and waves struck the northwest coast hardest. Aguadilla, the largest town in the region, was a bustling port of about 10,000 people. It was a hub for trade, fishing, and agriculture. After the wave, it was a cemetery. But the destruction did not stop there. The tsunami scoured the entire coastline from Punta Higuero to Rincon. In Isabela, the sea surged over the cliffs. In Mayagüez, the bay churned with debris. Survivors reported that the water smelled of salt and rot for days. Here is a detail the official reports barely mention. The first wave was not the only one. The sea did not calm, it kept pulsing. Smaller waves, still dangerous, crashed into the coast every few minutes for hours. Fishermen who had survived the initial surge were pulled from the wreckage by second and third waves. The ocean was a monster that kept biting. The response was slow, painfully slow. The US military, which had a strong presence on the island due to the recent war, did mobilize. Soldiers from Camp Las Casas in San Juan were dispatched, but the roads to the west coast were destroyed. The railroad was twisted. Telegraph lines were down. It took days for help to arrive, and when it did, the supplies were meager. The federal government in Washington sent a commission to investigate. They filed a report. It was thorough. It documented every death, every building, every wave height. Then the report was shelved. In the mainland press, the disaster was a footnote. The New York Times ran a short article on page 3. The Washington Post mentioned it in a single paragraph. There was no national mourning, no fundraising drives, no presidential address. The 116 dead were listed as statistics, and the world moved on. Why? Because Puerto Rico was an afterthought. It was a place where hurricanes and earthquakes were expected. The American public was tired of war. World War I had just ended a month earlier. The flu pandemic was still killing millions. The country had no bandwidth for a colony in crisis. But the deeper truth is darker. The people of Puerto Rico were not seen as fully American. They were brown, they were poor, they were far away. And in the hierarchy of American grief, they were at the bottom. The wave that killed them was not just a wave of water, it was a wave of indifference. And that indifference is why, over a century later, you have never heard this story. Let me take you beneath the surface, not just of the ocean, but of history. Because the 1918 tsunami was not a random act of God. It was a predictable event in a geologically volatile region. And the fact that we forgot it is not just a failure of memory. It is a failure of science communication. The Mona Passage is a tectonic nightmare. The North American plate and the Caribbean plate grind against each other in a deep, narrow trench. This zone has produced some of the most powerful earthquakes in Atlantic history. In 1918, the fault ruptured along a 60-kilometer stretch, 15 kilometers beneath the seafloor. The displacement was violent enough to lift the ocean floor by several meters. That vertical push is what generated the tsunami. The wave did not come from far away. It was born right there, in the channel between Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. That is why the warning time was only 4 minutes. In modern terms, this would be considered a near-field tsunami, the most dangerous kind. You cannot outrun it. You cannot predict it with current technology beyond a few minutes. And in 1918, there was no warning system at all, no sirens, no radio alerts, no evacuation plans. The only sign was the ocean pulling back, and many people, curious, walked toward the exposed seabed to collect fish. They were the first to die. Here is a scientific detail that should terrify you. The tsunami deposits from 1918 are still visible today. Geologists have found layers of sand and marine sediment 2 kilometers inland, buried under soil and vegetation. They have dated them. They match exactly. The wave was so powerful that it rearranged the coastline permanently. Inlets were filled. Beaches were reshaped. The geography of western Puerto Rico was rewritten in 10 minutes. But here is the problem. Despite this clear evidence, the risk was not communicated to the public. No tsunami education programs were implemented after 1918. No evacuation drills, no monuments. The knowledge was kept in academic journals, in Spanish language reports, in dusty archives. The people who lived on that coast were not told that it could happen again. And it did. In 1946, a magnitude 8.1 earthquake in the Dominican Republic generated a tsunami that killed 1,800 people. In 2010, a magnitude 7.0 earthquake in Haiti triggered a local tsunami that killed several. And in 2020, a magnitude 6.4 earthquake struck southern Puerto Rico. No tsunami that time. But the fear was real, because the memory of 1918 had faded so completely that no one knew what to expect. The silence of science is a slow poison. When we forget the past, we lose the ability to prepare for the future. And in Puerto Rico, that forgetting was not accidental. It was structural, it was colonial, it was a choice. We have the numbers: 116 dead, 40 from the tsunami. But numbers are cold. They do not tell you what it felt like to watch the sea rise and swallow your home. The real story is in the voices of the people who survived. And the tragedy is that almost none of those voices were recorded in English. The survivors of 1918 were Puerto Rican farmers, fishermen, and shopkeepers. They spoke Spanish. Many were illiterate. They did not write memoirs. They did not give interviews to American newspapers. Their stories were passed down orally, in family gatherings, in kitchen conversations, in the whispered warnings of grandmothers. And over time, those stories faded. The generation that lived through the wave died, and their memories died with them. But a few fragments survive. One survivor, an old man from Aguadilla, recalled that after the earthquake, he saw the sea retreat so far that he could see a shipwreck that had been underwater for decades. He said the exposed reef looked like a graveyard. Then he heard a sound, not a roar, a hiss, like a giant snake. He ran, he climbed a hill. He looked back and saw his house, his neighbors, his entire street, swallowed by a wall of green water. He never went back to the coast to live. Another witness, a woman from Rincon, described the aftermath. The bodies were stacked on carts. The smell was unbearable. The church was turned into a morgue. She said the American soldiers came with wagons and took the dead away, but they did not help the living, they just counted. She remembered that for weeks the ocean was brown with mud and debris, and that the fish tasted like iron. These stories are not in any official report. They are not in the National Archives. They are in the memory of a community that was never asked to share them. And that is the deepest wound. The disaster was documented by the colonizer, for the colonizer. The victims were objects of study, not subjects of history. There is one more detail that haunts me. In 2008, a team of geologists interviewed elderly residents of Aguadilla as part of a tsunami risk assessment. They found that many of them had never heard of the 1918 event. Their own grandparents had lived through it, but the story had not been passed down. Why? Because trauma can be silent, because the survivors wanted to forget, because there was no public monument, no school lesson, no annual remembrance. The wave was a family secret, buried like the sediment in the fields. We are now 106 years removed from that morning. The last living witnesses are gone. The oral history is closed. What remains is what we choose to recover. And that is what this reconstruction is for. To give voice to the voiceless, to break the silence. Let me show you something that will change how you see this story. Open a map of the United States. Look at Puerto Rico. It sits at the eastern edge of the Caribbean, a small green island in a blue sea. Now look at the west coast, Aguadilla, Rincon, Isabela. These are not just tourist towns, they are ground zero for one of the most dangerous tsunami zones in the American Atlantic. But here is the problem. On most American maps, Puerto Rico is not even labeled as part of the United States. It is a footnote, a box in the corner, a territory without full representation. And in the same way the island is erased from the map, the 1918 tsunami was erased from the national narrative. It did not happen in America. It happened in a place that America owned, but did not claim. Consider this contrast. In 1946, a tsunami struck Hilo, Hawaii. 159 people died. That disaster is well known. It is taught in schools. It has memorials. It led to the creation of the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center. Why? Because Hawaii became a state in 1959. Its disasters became American disasters. Its dead became American dead. But Puerto Rico in 1918 was not a state. It was not even a territory with full citizenship. The Jones Act of 1917 had just granted U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans, but only months before the wave hit. They were citizens in name, but not in practice. And when the wave came, the federal government treated them like subjects, not like countrymen. The erasure was physical too. After the tsunami, the US government did fund some reconstruction, but it was minimal. The port of Aguadilla was rebuilt slowly. The railroad was never fully restored. Many families simply left the coast and moved inland. The towns that survived did so on their own, with local resources and local labor. The federal dollars that flowed to San Francisco after 1906
or to Galveston after 1900 never reached Puerto Rico.
And here is the most painful detail. In the decades that followed, the US government conducted multiple studies of tsunami risk in the Caribbean. They identified the Mona Passage as a high-risk zone. They published papers, they held conferences, but they did not fund a warning system for Puerto Rico until the 2000s. For nearly a century, the people of the West Coast lived without protection, without knowledge, without memory. They were sitting ducks. The map of America is not a fixed thing. It is a story we tell ourselves. And in that story, some places are centered and others are pushed to the edge. Puerto Rico was pushed to the edge, and 116 people died in the margin. But this was not a margin. This was American soil. And the wave that hit it was American history. We just chose not to remember. We have walked through the ruins. We have heard the silence. We have seen the map of Eurasia. Now we arrive at the final question. What do we do with this knowledge? The 116 dead of 1918 cannot be brought back. The wave cannot be undone. But the forgetting can be stopped. Right here, right now, with you. This is not just a history lesson. This is a reckoning. Because the same forces that buried the 1918 tsunami are still at work today. Puerto Rico is still a territory. Its people are still second-class citizens in the American imagination. When Hurricane Maria struck in 2017, killing nearly 3,000 people, the federal response was slow, inadequate, and widely criticized. The world watched, but the world forgot again.
And when the next earthquake or tsunami hits the Mona Passage, and it will, because the fault is still active, will we be ready? Or will we repeat the same cycle of neglect?
The answer depends on memory. Memory is not passive. It is an act of will. It is a choice to look at the past and say, this matters. These people mattered. And that is why this story must be told. Not just in academic journals, not just in Spanish language archives, but in the mainstream, in English, on platforms like this one. Because if we do not tell it, no one will. Here is what you can do right now. First, share this video. Send it to a friend, post it on social media, put it in a group chat. The algorithm rewards engagement, but history rewards witnesses. Every share is a vote against erasure. Every comment is a stone on the grave of indifference. Second, subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell, because we are not done. There are more forgotten disasters, more erased maps, more stories that need to be pulled from the silence. And if you want to be part of that recovery, you need to stay connected. The wave came, the wave receded, the world moved on. But we do not have to. We can stop, we can remember, and we can make sure that 116 souls are no longer invisible. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for refusing to forget.